Folk Tales Sketchbook.
What if the most feared creature in the entire forest had no real power at all, and every single soul it ever terrorized was only one calm, deliberate decision away from watching it collapse completely? An old man named Grandpa Nasuba is sitting by a fire tonight, and he has a story about a skunk, a wise chief, and the oldest trick that arrogance has ever fallen for. By the time this story is over, you will never look at the loudest, most threatening presence in the room quite the same way again. The fire is lit, the night is still, and Sikak the Skunk is already strutting down the trail. This story unfolds in the middle era of the great woodland nations, long before roads of iron divided the land, in a time when the forests stretched, unbroken from ridge to ridge, and every river still carried the name the people had given it at the beginning. The village at the heart of this tale sits at the foot of a gentle slope, sheltered by maple and oak trees that had been standing since before the oldest grandmother in the community was born, rooted so deep that even the strongest autumn storms moved around them out of something close to respect. It was a calm village, a generous one, the kind of place where neighbours left food at each other's doorways without being asked, and where disagreements were settled before the next sunrise. A settlement where the people had built something rare and worth protecting, which was a life of quiet dignity, held together by mutual trust and long memory. All of that calm had an uninvited shadow, and that shadow wore a coat of sharp black and white and moved with a slow, deliberate swagger that announced itself well before it arrived. Sikak the Skunk was not large by any measure the forest used to reckon greatness. He was small, round, and unhurried in his movements, carrying himself with the particular confidence of a creature who has confused inconvenience, with authority for so long that the confusion has become his entire personality. His only genuine asset was the spray he kept tucked beneath his tail, a weapon so foul and so thoroughly miserable in its effect that the mere suggestion of its deployment was enough to empty a clearing in moments. Sikak had discovered this power early in his life and had drawn from it a conclusion that was simple, deeply satisfying, and completely wrong: that fear and respect were the same thing, that the space creatures put between themselves and him was a measure of his importance, rather than a measure of their reluctance to have a ruined afternoon. Every morning he walked the main trail, and every morning the same scene repeated. The deer grazing at the clearing's edge would lift their heads, read the air, and slip quietly into the trees without argument or drama. The beavers who had been working their dams since before the light turned gold would drop their branches and retreat to the far bank without so much as a glance backward. The bears, whose shoulders were wider than Sikak was long, and whose judgment was therefore the most credible available, would simply turn and walk a different direction, as if they had always intended to go that way, and the skunk's arrival was merely a coincidence of timing. Sikak watched all of this with enormous satisfaction and told himself, and anyone unlucky enough to be within earshot, that the whole forest trembled before his majesty, that not one creature in the world dared stand against him, that he was the most powerful being under the sky. He believed this completely and without examination, and that belief, unquestioned and unchallenged by a single lived experience that contradicted it, was the thing that made him not just arrogant, but fragile in a way that he could not yet see, and would not see until the village chief decided it was time to show him. The autumn arrived the way it always did in that part of the land, gradually, and then all at once, the leaves shifting from green to amber to a deep, burning red that made the whole ridge look as though the earth itself were holding a celebration. And in a sense it was. Each year, when the last of the harvest had been gathered, and the hillside berries had all been collected, and the stores were full, the village held its autumn feast, a gathering that was about far more than food, a formal and deeply felt acknowledgement that the land had kept its end of an ancient agreement, and that the people were gathered together to honour that fact, and to express gratitude in the most complete way. They knew which was through the preparation and the sharing of everything good they had made with their hands throughout the growing season. The preparations had been underway for 3 full days before the smell reached Sikak. Roasted corn, its outer layers darkened and its sweetness concentrated by heat, filled the air above the cooking fires. Crushed berries had been reduced to a thick, fragrant sauce that carried the memory of late summer in every breath of steam it released. Maple had been poured in slow, amber streams over everything that could receive it, and the smoke from the fires wove all of these aromas together and carried them across the tree line, with the efficiency of a messenger who knows the recipient will be interested. Sikak was sitting on a familiar log at the forest's edge, doing what he spent most mornings doing, which was thinking about himself, when the smell arrived. He lifted his nose, turned his head in the direction of the village, and made a decision that required no deliberation whatsoever, because no part of his thinking included the concept that anything in the world might not be available to him simply because he wanted it. He entered the feast grounds with his tail raised at half-mast, the posture he reserved for situations where he wanted to communicate capability without yet committing to demonstration. The villagers saw him immediately and responded the way they always did, which was carefully, mothers drawing children close without sudden movements, men going very still with platters of food in their hands, the laughter and conversation that had filled the clearing settling into a taut, watchful quiet that had the texture of a breath held too long. Sikak crossed the entire feast ground without hesitation, walked directly to the central blanket, where the chief sat, stepped onto it without pausing to consider whether this was an appropriate thing to do, and surveyed the food arranged there with the critical eye of a guest who has decided in advance that nothing will quite meet his standards. He selected the largest portion of roasted corn, turned to face the assembled tribe with his tail now fully raised, and his small eyes bright with what he understood as authority, and told them, loudly and without a trace of embarrassment, that he would require the best of everything they had prepared, that he expected prompt delivery, and that if they chose not to cooperate willingly, he would deliver something of his own making, and that they would find his contribution to the occasion considerably less pleasant than the feast they had spent 3 days putting together. The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms when a crowd is holding itself still, in order to see what the person it trusts most will do next. And every eye in the clearing moved to the wise chief, who was sitting, cross-legged at the edge of the blanket, with the stillness of a man who is not empty of thought, but extraordinarily full of it. He was a man of middle years, old enough to have learned patience as a practice, rather than a temperament, young enough to still find situations like this one genuinely interesting, rather than merely tiresome. And his face in that moment offered no indication of what was coming. The warriors on either side of him had already shifted their weight forward in the particular way of people preparing to act, which the chief acknowledged with a single raised hand, and they went still immediately, trained to the gesture. Then the chief did something that no one in the crowd was expecting. He rose slowly, unhurried, straightening himself to his full height and bowed. Not a small nod, not a polite inclination of the head that could be interpreted as merely good manners, but a full, deliberate, sustained bow of the kind extended to visiting leaders of great nations or to messengers carrying word from ancestors. He held it for a long moment, then raised himself and looked at Sikak with an expression that wore the precise features of reverence, the open eyes, the slight softening around the mouth, the careful attention of someone in the presence of something they consider important. He said that the tribe was honored by Sikak's arrival, that the elders had spoken of this day, that the ancestors themselves had foretold it in the old stories, and that the people had waited longer than they could easily say for the arrival of the spirit the stories described. He told Sikak that the ancient accounts of his people spoke of a being of tremendous power who would one day come to them wearing a coat of black and white, whose presence at a gathering was considered the highest blessing a community could receive, a sign that the season ahead would be met with strength, and that the tribe stood under the protection of forces greater than any ordinary difficulty. He delivered all of this with the absolute conviction of a man who had decided before the conversation began, exactly where it was going to end, without a single break in his composure, without any suggestion in his voice or his posture that he was doing anything other than stating plain fact. Sikak, for the first time in living memory, did not immediately respond. His tail lowered a few degrees. He tilted his head. He looked at the chief the way someone looks at a locked door when it opens without resistance, with the particular surprise of a person whose plan assumed an obstacle that has simply decided not to be there. The pause lasted only a moment. Then, visibly, the pride returned, larger than before, inflated by the chief's words into something so enormous that it took on a slightly comic shape, and Sikak straightened himself, lifted his chin, and told the chief that, yes, the ancestors had been correct, and that the tribe was fortunate indeed to have recognized him so quickly. The chief did not stop there, because he understood something that most people come to understand only after being burned by it at least once, which is that a truly arrogant creature does not merely want to be praised, it wants to be explained. It wants a framework, a story large enough to hold it, a cosmological reason why its particular quality is not merely good, but uniquely significant in the design of things, because simple compliments satisfy vanity for only a moment before it comes back, wanting more, while a well-constructed mythology can keep a vain creature occupied and moving in a chosen direction for as long as the mythology holds together. The chief had identified this and had prepared accordingly, and he began building the story carefully, one layer at a time, watching Sikak's responses with the patient attention of a craftsman, watching a material under pressure to see exactly how much it will take before it changes shape. He told Sikak that the spray he carried was not, as lesser and less informed observers might assume, a simple defensive mechanism developed through ordinary animal circumstance. The elders, the chief said with great gravity, referred to it by a different name. They called it the sacred perfume of judgment, a fragrance of such elevated spiritual character that only those with truly pure hearts could receive it without being overwhelmed, because it operated not on the body, but on the soul, and souls that had not yet done the necessary work of becoming worthy were simply not prepared for an encounter with something of that intensity. Lesser creatures ran from it, the chief explained, not because it was unpleasant, but because their spirits were not yet ready for the experience. This was not a failure in them, but a statement of where they were in their development, and there was no shame in it. Sikak absorbed all of this with his eyes half closed and his tail swaying in a slow, satisfied arc, the physical expression of a creature that has heard something confirming everything it has always believed about itself, and is now engaged in the pleasant work of allowing the confirmation to settle fully into place. The chief then said that the tribe had a request, if the great Sikak was willing to hear it. He described the approaching winter harvest and the old tradition associated with it, a practice in which a figure of recognized spiritual power would stand at the center of the village and release the sacred perfume outward in every direction, blessing the crops and the stored food and the people themselves against the difficulties of the cold months ahead. He asked, with the humility of a man making a request of someone whose answer he genuinely does not control, whether Sikak might be willing to perform this blessing for them, and in doing so, secure the welfare of the entire community through winter. Sikak held a pause of what he considered appropriate diplomatic weight, then told the chief that the tribe had shown great wisdom in making this request, that he would perform the blessing willingly, that the community should consider themselves fortunate, and that they should prepare the center of the village at once. The chief bowed again. The warriors turned away, and their shoulders moved in a way that was not consistent with grief. The villagers prepared the center of the settlement with the seriousness of a people who have been given clear instructions by someone they trust completely, which is to say, they did it efficiently and without wasted motion, and with an alertness in their eyes that had nothing ceremonial about it. At the chief's direction, passed quietly from person to person, while Sikak stood admiring the reflection of his own coat in the still surface of a water pot. Each villager had fashioned a simple mask from river clay, pressed firm over the nose and mouth, and allowed to harden in the afternoon heat until it held its shape without support. Children help their parents apply the clay with the focused attention of young people who have been told that something important is happening and who intend to be useful in it. The grandmothers who had been watching from the shade offered guidance on thickness and coverage, which was taken seriously. From any distance, the preparation looked exactly like the elaborate ritual attention of a community getting ready to receive a significant spiritual event, which was precisely what it was. The ritual in question simply not being the one Sikak had been told to expect. The high, flat rock at the centre of the village had been cleared and swept clean, and when Sikak was escorted to it with full ceremony by two of the chief's senior advisers, walking on either side of him at a respectful distance, he climbed it with the ease of a creature that has confused a stage with a throne, and found the confusion entirely comfortable. He looked out at the assembled crowd, every face turned upward to watch him, every person wearing a clay mask that gave the gathering a unified, attentive appearance, and felt the thing he always felt when he was being observed, a warmth in his chest that he called power. And that was, in fact, simply the satisfaction of being the centre of attention in a room full of quiet people. The chief raised his hand, and the crowd began. They called for the sacred fragrance. They called for the blessing of the great Sikak. They maintained a slow, steady rhythm in their clapping, and lifted their voices in an ascending appeal for more, and from any distance. It sounded exactly like the fervent request of a community in genuine need of something only Sikak could provide. Sikak needed no further encouragement. He turned, positioned himself, and released the first spray with considerable enthusiasm, sweeping it in a wide arc across the crowd. The villagers behind their clay masks clapped harder and called for more, saying the blessing had not yet reached the far edges of the clearing, and that the winter required full coverage if it was to be properly addressed. Sikak, animated by an ego that could not distinguish sincerity from performance when both were delivering the same message, turned and released again, and then again after that, each time to the sound of the crowd calling for more, and each time responding with the generosity of a creature that believes its supply is limited only by its own willingness. Every form of power has a physical reality, which is that it is finite, and that deploying it faster than it can be replenished is not a demonstration of strength, but a countdown. And the only question is whether the creature doing the deploying understands this before or after the moment it becomes relevant. Sikak did not know this about himself. He had never been required to spray continuously over any extended period, because the mere suggestion had always been sufficient. And so he had no accurate picture of what his reserves actually contained, or how they would behave under the conditions of sustained, enthusiastic, and entirely uninterrupted use. He was about to find out in front of a large audience. The crowd chanted, and he sprayed. They called for more, and he delivered more. The afternoon light began its long decline toward evening, the shadows, stretching out from the base of the rock in the direction of the tree line, and the children in the crowd, who had been coached by their parents on the importance of consistent rhythm, kept the clapping steady and encouraging, and Sikak, standing above all of it with his tail working and his expression set in, the benevolent concentration of a king distributing largesse, interpreted every call for more as confirmation that what he was doing was working, that the crowd's enthusiasm was proportional to the quality of his blessing, that he was winning something, even if the specific nature of the prize was not entirely clear to him at this moment. Then, somewhere in the descent of the afternoon toward its cooler end, between one spray and the attempt that followed it, he noticed something. The arc was smaller than it had been, the reach shorter. The crowd called for continuation, and he turned to provide it. And what arrived was not the full, powerful expression he was accustomed to, but something considerably diminished in both force and distance. He strained. He tried again with more concentrated effort. The result was worse by every measure. The crowd was still chanting, still maintaining the rhythm, still watching from behind their clay masks, with what appeared from the height of the rock to be the same reverent attention they had shown since the beginning. and Sikak told himself that the reduction was temporary, that beings of significant spiritual capacity experienced natural variation, that he merely needed a brief interval to consolidate himself before continuing. He did not get the interval. The moment arrived without ceremony or announcement. He turned, positioned himself with full intention, applied everything he had, and produced nothing at all. He tried a second time, still nothing. A third time confirmed the result. He stood on the rock in the cooling early evening air, tail raised, body yielding absolutely nothing, the crowd still chanting below him, and for the first time since he had learned what he could do, the gap between what he believed himself to be and what he was at that precise moment became visible to him. He looked down at the chief. The chief looked up at him with the unhurried attention of a man who has always known how a thing was going to end, and has simply been patient enough to wait for it. Then the chief reached up and removed his clay mask. When the chief removed his mask, the rest of the village followed, one face at a time, and the effect was not a dramatic transformation, but something quieter and more complete, the way a room changes character when someone opens a window, and the air that had been held at careful, deliberate stillness is suddenly allowed to simply be itself again. The chief did not speak immediately. He looked up at Sikak with the patient attention of someone who has just completed an experiment and is examining the outcome without rush, without judgment, without any need to make the moment larger than what it already was. Sikak stood on the rock in the full exposure of the early evening light and understood, in the particular way that understanding arrives when it is too late to negotiate with it, that the situation had changed in a fundamental way, and that the change was not in his favor. Around the entire perimeter of the clearing, the forest animals had gathered. Word travels through a forest with remarkable efficiency when something unusual is taking place, and the deer and the beavers and the bears had all positioned themselves at the tree line over the course of the afternoon, drawn by the noise and the chanting and the smell, which had been considerable in its early phases, and had remained because the situation was developing in a direction they found genuinely worth watching to its conclusion. The bears were the first to step forward. They did not rush. They walked into the clearing in the slow, deliberate manner of creatures who have simply decided that the previous arrangement no longer applies, and who feel no need to make a production of the change in their thinking. They looked up at Sikak, and their expressions were not angry, not aggressive, not the focused attention of animals with something to resolve. They were amused, in the specific way that very large animals are amused when something that has long been causing them inconvenience turns out to have been much smaller than advertised. The wolves came in from the north edge of the trees. The deer stepped forward from the south. Even the beavers, who were generally far too practical in their orientation to involve themselves in anything that did not have a direct application to dam construction, had made the journey to witness this particular conclusion. They all looked up at the small creature standing on the rock with his tail lowered and his resources entirely exhausted. And they saw, for the first time without the filter of anticipatory dread, exactly what was there. He was small. He was tired. He had no claws worth noting, no speed that would carry him out of trouble, no strength that would allow him to hold a position. He had possessed exactly one genuine capability, had been maneuvered by a calm, thoughtful opponent into deploying it until it was gone, and was now standing in front of everyone who had ever stepped aside for him, without the one thing that had made stepping aside seem like the practical choice. The laughter began with the bears, low and rolling, the kind of laughter that is not designed to wound, but that is absolutely accurate in its assessment. It spread to the wolves, and then to the deer, and then through the whole gathering, and Sikak looked out at all of it, at every creature that had once moved away at his approach, now standing still and laughing, and understood that the palace he had built on the foundation of other creatures' avoidance had just come down, and he ran into the bushes without looking back. The chief waited until the clearing had settled back into the quiet that belongs to evenings when something important has resolved itself, and then he turned to face his people and spoke without hurry, without the raised voice of a person trying to make sure a lesson lands. Just the steady, conversational tone of someone describing something true. He said that what they had just witnessed together was not a performance or a game or a punishment. It was a demonstration of something that the people needed to carry with them, because the world produced creatures like Sikak in every generation, in every forest, in every community, and the response that the tribe had just practiced together was the only response that actually worked. He told them that Sikak had never been powerful in any real sense. He had been frightening, and those are different things, separated by a gap that is easy to close once you understand it is there. Power, the chief said, builds something. It makes things exist that did not exist before. It holds weight. It creates conditions that outlast the moment of its application. Fear only clears a space, and clearing a space is not building anything. It is just removing an obstacle temporarily, and the moment the fear stops, the space closes again, and there is nothing left where the power was supposed to be. He said that a creature whose only resource is the willingness of others to be afraid of, it is not a king. It is a loan that comes due the moment you decide to stop paying. The tribe had decided to stop paying, and the debt had been settled by the skunk himself, without anyone having to raise a hand. He paused and looked at each face in the gathering before he continued, and said to remember this, not because skunks were rare, but because the pattern was common, and the world would always supply new versions of it. And the response that he was asking them to remember was this: meet the threat with calm. Let it talk. Give it the stage it is asking for. Let it exhaust its own supply, and then take off your mask. Now Grandpa Nasuba looks up from the story that has settled into the air between him and the fire, and he looks directly at you, the way he does when he is about to say something he means more than the rest. He says that if you have ever spent any time in the comment sections of this beautiful and occasionally bewildering internet, you have already met Sikak. You know the profile. Loud, absolute, threatening, radiating the confidence of someone whose power has never been properly tested, because people have always moved before the testing could begin. And Grandpa Nasuba, who has lived long enough to find this more interesting than upsetting, wants you to know that the chief's method works just as well on a screen as it ever did in a clearing. Do not panic. Do not argue back in the way they want you to, which is loudly and with visible distress. Do not give them the fear that is the only currency they know how to spend. Let them spray until they are empty, which they always eventually are, and then take off your clay mask and smile, because that is all the power you actually need, and unlike theirs, it will not run out. A bully's power is not their own. It is borrowed from the fear of everyone around them. And the moment that fear is withdrawn through calm, clear thinking rather than panic or anger, the bully is left with nothing but the emptiness they were always carrying underneath the noise. The wise chief never raised his voice, never called for his warriors, and never gave Sikak the confrontation that would have made the skunk's behavior seem justified. He simply redirected the threat, using the bully's own arrogance as the engine of defeat. True strength does not empty itself chasing applause. True leadership does not meet toxicity with matching toxicity, and the most effective weapon against a creature that rules by fear is the simple, steady act of deciding to stop being afraid. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell us what your clay mask looks like, because we want to know how you deal with the Sikaks in your life. And if you want to hear every story Grandpa Nasuba has left to tell, subscribe and make sure the bell is turned on, because the fire is always lit, and the next tale is already on its way.
Folk Tales Sketchbook.